So in 1984, a long time ago, when I got to Everett, I joined Medical Anesthesia Associates, and hopefully you've seen Tom Subich on the website as well. Tom was here as one of the partners in the group when I came. We had a fairly small group at that point, and we were the only anesthesia group in town at that time. We had nurse anesthetists that were sort of loosely supervised, but again, it was a relatively small operation. I think 5 or 6 anesthesiologists. So at that point, Everett Clinic had decided that they wanted to start an anesthesia department. In fact, they had made that decision around the time I was interviewing, and I was told at the time that actually after I accepted the job that Everett Clinic may try to make their own anesthesia group. So they in fact tried. They brought in a couple of anesthesiologists. See if I could, Ross Appleyard was one, I can't remember the other one. They didn't last very long. I think the Everett Clinic at the time didn't really understand the anesthesia business, and so their call was a bit on the onerous side, and I think their pay was a little bit low. But at any rate, they didn't last too long. They ended up leaving town. We then had John Kemp and a group of anesthesiologists from San Diego who came to town and eventually became established as the Everett Clinic Anesthesia Group. So at that point, things had split pretty much down party lines. Surgeons that I had worked with for 4 or 5 years finally began to transition their work out of from Medical Anesthesia Associates to the Everett Clinic. So that process was a bit of a painful transition in town, but I think was predicated or begun before I got here, and not something I totally understood. As things progressed on in Medical Anesthesia Associates, our anesthesia group joined Western Washington Medical Group, and Everett Clinic continued on their path. So late in my stay with Medical Anesthesia Associates, I was what we called the office manager for Medical Anesthesia Associates, took that over from Dick Galuska, and then as we joined Western Washington, maintained essentially that position through the next few years and became vice president of Western Washington. Finally, as the complexity of cases in Everett and the difficulties of cross-covering the different campuses, the fact that the hospitals had joined into one hospital began to put pressure on, I think, the entire anesthesia community in the hospital to try to become a little bit more efficient and streamlined. So at that point, we began conversations with the hospital to try to become one anesthesia group as opposed to having separate groups for Everett Clinic and for Western Washington. So as the complexity of cases in Everett, both from the standpoint of the number of subspecialists doing surgery cases, cardiac, vascular, neurosurgical, from the standpoint of complexity of cases, the types of cases, and how sick the patients were, along with the fact that the hospitals had now joined together and had become one hospital, and had for several years, seemed to exert a little bit of pressure on the anesthesia community to become one group. And I think we understood that that would be a better delivery model for us. Although I think the quality of anesthesia care was excellent at the time, I think it was perhaps a bit inefficient to have 2 separate groups. So at the time that we realized that in our conversations with the hospital and with each other, both Western Washington and Everett Clinic, that we would eventually form one anesthesia group, we had some choices to make. We could either go out on our own and form our separate group and begin from the beginning, or we could find another group to join. So as we looked around to see who might be have interest perhaps of having an Everett division, Pacific Anesthesia, which was then just in Tacoma, was very interested in joining with us. Part of what I guess was the history of Pacific Anesthesia was that they did not use nurse anesthetists. It was an all-physician model. In Everett, we had had a model that was a bit of a hangover from earlier days. It was more of an unsupervised or partially supervised model. And if we were supervising one of the nurse anesthetists, we were also doing our own cases. So there were times when we would have to switch rooms, and we would be asked to go to another room and switch. So despite the fact that we had really excellent nurse anesthetists, we had great relationship and we're doing well, the model seemed to have some limitations, and the fact that by joining Pacific Anesthesia we could gain their infrastructure and work with them so that it would be a lower cost model, a way of sort of containing the costs of doing anesthesia in the community, where we would have access to better contracts and access to their infrastructure, and perhaps move the model in a little bit of a different direction. So we went through the very painful process of having to basically separate from the nurse anesthetists that work with us. Nikki Nickerson, who went to the Everett Clinic, Coco Cantrell, who left town, Roger Strand, Lynn Ogden, both of whom were asked to work at the Everett Clinic in their surgery centers, Kathy Stiles, who initially went to Mount Vernon and then came back to Providence in another capacity. So all of these things made for a very difficult transition for us, but a different model, one that was perhaps a little bit more cost-effective in that we had, again, this structure that we had with Pacific Anesthesia, and one that we felt would be a model that we could use in our multi-campus system a little bit easier, with more interchangeability of parts, I guess would be the one way to think of it. So we went through that transition, and in the process of forming the One Anesthesia group here in Everett and also joining with Pacific Anesthesia in Tacoma, we worked with the hospital and were able to get them to recognize that in this setting where we had now lost some of the ambulatory surgery work that was being done at the Everett Clinic and some of the ambulatory work that was being done by Everett Bone and Joint, that in order to maintain the kind of high quality and efficient delivery system, that we would have to work with the hospital in some way to supplement the anesthesia incomes in this community, to turn us more from, I guess, what we consider to be a farm club, our farm league, where anesthesiologists would come to Everett and then join other groups, and primarily on the east side, in the Bellevue, Kirkland area, Overlake and Evergreen. So we lost a number of partners, usually 2 or 3 a year, to other hospitals. So subsequent to us joining together, working more closely with the hospital, we had what became the first experience for me of a stable anesthesia group without the entrance and exodus of a number of people every year.